So I'm just going to very happy to introduce Izabella Kaminski to you all. Kaminska, I'm sorry, who is an ex-editor at one of my favorite finance blogs, which was from the Financial Times Alphaville blog. And she also happens to know a lot about money, central banks, and financial journalism in general. And now I saw she was starting this new initiative, The Blind Spot. I just posted a link in the chat as well, which is about independent journalism. And so I really wanted to talk to her about this and about the media landscape. And then I think we definitely should also talk a little bit about what's going on, what the biggest news story there is at the moment, I think. So I'm just going to check in the chat. So, Izabella, welcome to the Money and Macro channel. Did I introduce you properly?
Yes, that sounds fantastic. I'm very flattered by that nice introduction. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So shall we dive right into it? Shall we? So just for the audience as well. So my idea for this is a live chat. So definitely there will also be some Q&A moments. So just my idea is to talk to Izabella, and then at some point when we've exhausted a subject, we're going to just have a little break, have a look at the chat and see what you all are asking and saying, and then we'll respond to that or answer questions. It will probably mostly be Izabella, since she is the guest of honor. So, Izabella, I was wondering, so this was the main question that was on my mind when I saw you tweet about this, about your new initiative of independent journalism. And so my question was immediately, why? Like, what's wrong with FT Alphaville? Why do we need you to be independent?
So, I mean, there's I've left the FT with what I would say good relations, because I'm still doing a few pieces for them every now and then as a freelancer. But I think this is a wider problem than just the FT. I think the nature of Alphaville. So Alphaville was, of its era. I think it was a time when it was in its peak heyday. Kind of, we didn't worry about copyright. We were blogging in a very reactionary way. The whole point of blogging was that it was rough. It was reactive. Sometimes we didn't get stuff right. There were typos. We edited each other's work, and the idea was to get stuff out there, and it was to differentiate from the core product, which is a totally different beast. Mm-hmm. It's journalism, what we were doing, but it was in a new framework, right? And I think what's happened is that as blogging's become more established, it's become professionalized. So in the early days, it was very easy to be forgiving about some of the kind of knee-jerk stuff we were doing, and I think it always added value, even when we made mistakes, because I think a lot of this time we were being reactionary in the style of markets when we're trying to learn and see new things, and we're kind of scouting the internet and doing that OSINT sort of stuff where we're like, hey, this really matters and blah blah blah, and just trying to pull information and aggregate things as much as give analysis and insight. But as things formalized, being a little scatty like that was less and less easy to get away with. There was a different expectation. And I think we, bureaucratic and commercial forces integrated Alphaville increasingly into the core of the FT. And the differentiation as an independent platform was lost to a certain degree. And that meant that people who went off the tribe and stumbled onto our content often didn't understand that it was a more not speculative, but like more, it wasn't the finished product of the FT to the same degree. The community was conversational. The whole point was that it was personality driven. It was, my writing. I'm not a great writer. I'm a really bad writer, actually. I'm dyslexic and I make typos, and I'm just, I'm more about the ideas and picking up good ideas and stories and speaking to people and pinpointing interesting sort of developments that maybe are being missed by the markets. That's what I do best. Mm-hmm. I don't operate as well in a more formal structure. That's just my own personal inclination, right? And people are very forgiving about my weaknesses, but I think it became increasingly difficult to do that sort of stuff in the new era in the FT, where everything is far more, it's always been professional, don't get me wrong, but like Alphaville became consumed by the core. It was a centralization sort of thing. And the appetite for the sort of risky stuff we used to do and the reactive stuff. And also, very importantly, I think the cross-beat stuff, there just wasn't that appetite anymore. So
what's the cross-beat stuff, if I may interrupt?
So I think one of the in the early days of Alphaville, we were our own little segment. We were in the FT, but we were also kind of overlooked. We had a much higher reputation externally than we did internally. Internally, people were like, who are these like weird kids on the internet? This was like before anyone was on Twitter. Like people would be like, what's Twitter? It's like insignificant nonsense. And, we were all on Twitter from the very early days and working away. And we had no limits because we were our own thing. And people didn't really consider us a rival internally because we were so low on the spectrum of internal respect. We were right at the bottom, right? So people didn't see us as a not a threat is maybe the wrong word, as a challenger to their beats, right?
Okay.
So we could easily write about any topic. But as our profile went up, I think it became harder to just sort of intrude into other sectors and have a different opinion, because Alphaville's whole point is that we're kind of like an FT hedge. So if the FT is saying this, we would sometimes experiment with different opinions and work at things from a different perspective, because I think that's that's my personal philosophy as well, is that I think you have to look at things from all sorts of different perspectives. And as we matured, this became more problematic. And I totally understand why like beat reporters would be annoyed when Alphaville's coming in and saying, chasing the same contacts and then delivering a different conclusion to what they're saying, right? It can get annoying. So we're like an internal sort of personality deficiency within the FT, or an anti-FT, right?
Right.
And I think in that sense, after a while, we became increasingly constrained, and we looked at topics that were being missed by sector reporters. So often we ended up doing stuff in between the lines, whether it was fintech was a good example, because the financial reporters kind of thought it was a tech story. The tech reporters thought it was a finance story. So nobody was really doing it properly. And then Alphaville was there and we picked it all up. It was all very nice, low-hanging fruit for us. But those sort of cross-sector things become more complicated. And I definitely felt that there was a story. I thought my inclination around this time last year was that the story was evolving into a sort of global World War III thing. At the time, like this time last year. This was very taboo. Like you couldn't really say that sort of stuff.
So what's happening? What's happening today, basically, is what you mean.
Yeah,
then.
And I felt, so this is when I originally kind of realized that I don't think the sort of reporting I want to do is going to be easy to do in the structure of a very formal organization. So I think the polymath journalist is sort of about to really be, incredibly valued in the current environment, because you need someone who knows about finance, I'm not a military tactical person at all, but I am interested in it, and I follow it enough to have some insight, and I want to learn with my readers. And it's like with epidemiology, like when no one really knew about epidemiologists, but markets now do. We had to learn as the story evolved. So I was kind of positioning myself for this new era that I think is coming. And I realized that I wasn't going to be able to compete with it would be very difficult and controversial and very cumbersome to kind of talk about Ukraine. I think internally, you can't cross politics and markets and sort of, very reactionary or I say reactionary in a sort of market reactionary way, coverage at the FT very easily, because everything is now very politicized and you have to be very careful. So your independence, but you can't also at the same time give quality coverage unless you're prepared to take a risk and take a few sort of, speculative punts every now and then. So
I just wanted to ask like clarifying question, because you mentioned, so I was, no, what I'm doing is more like looking for an example, because what you're talking about is that, okay, so you can't break every story as easily, or perhaps not in the shape that you want, especially not when it comes to geopolitics. But then also you mentioned, which I think is very interesting, because I did not pick up on that at all last year. You said, okay, I already saw this sort of World War III narrative last year. So my question really is like, what were the signals last year that you picked up? And then maybe as a follow-up, what couldn't you write about it? Like, what did they say?
Well, I think, one of the early things that I was interested in was the lab leak theory, for example. And I found that to be the entire media response to that narrative, I found very confusing, because it seemed a credible theory for me from very early on. And I thought there was enough evidence and public domain evidence to, at a minimum, to warrant an investigation to see if there's anything in it. And there seemed to be a terrible taboo and stigma with raising this. And unless you're in a position of authority or within a remit where you can raise these sort of topics in editorial, environments, and most people aren't in that position because they seem, I was the editor of Alphaville, but even for me, saying, I think we should do this story, it seems like you're putting it yourself out there, because the risk is someone deems you a conspiracy theorist, and you end up kind of compromising yourself internally and your own reputation. So I felt kind of frustrated. So I started making my own inquiries just because I found the story interesting. And around February last year, I think, I became quite convinced that there was a story there at a minimum that we had to cover. Long story short, there was a bit of resistance in following it up. And then eventually by sort of May, it became clear that this was a legitimate avenue of inquiry. And I was put on the story, which is great. But I found it very frustrating how the story was being managed and how we could cooperate or not cooperate. And I felt, so the reason I'm telling this story is that it was in the process of thinking about these issues and the aftermath and the consequences and the geopolitics related to China and also to Russia's role within those geopolitics that made me realize quite early on that there was going to be an aftermath, and that aftermath did not look like it was going to be a good aftermath. So my inclination was, that combined with the economic fragility that we were facing, and the again, I was very concerned about inflation very early on, and that was another taboo subject, I feel, in certain serious corners, because it is such a it is such a sort of Bitcoiner narrative or whatever. But when the facts change, you have to change your mind. Yeah. And I felt like that was impeding sensible journalism, because there was such a fear of being branded X or Y. I mean, I don't want to lots of people might have had different reasons for not thinking there was going to be inflation, but I just felt there was a lot of stigma and a lot of pressure. And when I did try to go out there, because before, when Alphaville would go a bit out there with different theories, which did end up being true in the long run, the resistance was usually external, and when it became sort of more internal, it felt a little bit frustrating, because you feel like a newspaper should be the sort of place where you can tolerate different perspectives, and as long as the argument is as long as the logic is well argued, I think it's fair. I entertained on Alphaville many different perspectives I didn't necessarily agree with myself. As long as they were well argued and presented in a convincing and credible way, I think it was fair enough. So that's the context.
Yeah. Okay. So what I find very interesting about this already is that sort of I actually had a little bit of a similar experience in academia, in the sense that I always thought like, okay, academia, universities, that's the place where you can entertain new ideas, right? New radical ideas in economics, in my case, because I'm an economist. And then I found out, like as a PhD student, that's really not the case, because then you don't get published. And there's actually very strong gatekeeping and a pretty strong communal narrative. I don't know if you can say that, but like common narrative. If you stray outside of that, and that's actually partially what motivated me to move from university to YouTube. So I see some parallels there. But I do wonder what you think, because what you mentioned now is, as I heard it at least, is very much sort of why you wanted to move to independent journalism. But I'm also quite interested in why the world, just to put it bluntly, I don't mean this negatively, needs your independent journalism, if you catch my drift.
Well, I think it's interesting that you felt similar in academia. I mean, I think there is a broader problem related to sort of bureaucracy and commercial forces and funding and and a sort of specialist situation as well, where people who are not specialists fear they can't criticize specialists, and everyone's becoming more and more of a specialist, right? So this kind of constrains critical thinking, and it constrains debate. And, you know, in the beginning, I think I was happy I think it's important to operate within a structure that can criticize your own work, right? Because now that I'm independent, I think what I really miss about being in a more formal structure is feedback and being, you know, I often would joke to my colleagues that they often save me from myself, because, you know, everyone has inclinations that, you know, you want to write something immediately, and then when you sleep on it, you're like, oh no, actually I shouldn't have written it. I'm glad I reflected and I didn't do that. When you're independent, you're in your own bubble, and you don't have that sort of check on yourself. So I do miss, I think, broader colleagues, but that's why the blind spot hopefully won't just be me. I'm very keen to recruit as soon as I can, as soon as the cash flow allows. I want to broaden it out and have more team members with different perspectives to me, but all of them, I think the common denominator will be that I'm looking for people who are creative thinkers and who bring something really quite unique to the table, not necessarily aligned with my thinking, but I think it's important to look creatively at a lot of different things that are going on today. And I feel that there is a fear to do so sometimes, because the status quo is so entrenched and there is such a stigma associated with appearing to challenge it that it just doesn't get challenged.
So, yeah, that sounds good, but it didn't entirely answer my question. But what I was wondering, so maybe I can answer it for you, and then you can just say that I'm wrong or not. But so how I see this is because I find it very interesting when you said, like, okay, when we started this blog, FT Alphaville, which, by the way, for those who don't know it, is still a great blog, and I think it's free. It used to be free, but you just had to register. Is that still the case, by the way?
It was when I left.
Okay.
I'm not sure about what's happened since.
I think so. Yeah. But because I read it, I started reading it, I think around 2010 or something like that. And I do remember that, like when you were talking about it, I was like, it is true that I became less interested in it, or at least that I found myself less able to differentiate it from the Financial Times, because I also love just reading the Financial Times, and that sort of more memorable stories were published in those early days. So that did resonate with me. So and then I think it makes total sense that you sound like a little bit, and again, tell me if it's not true, but you sound like a little bit like a contrarian. In the sense that you seem to be excited by sort of controversial stories and breaking them. So that sounds like an excellent move in that sense. But I was also thinking about why I am excited that you're going to do this, because what I think you might bring is still that journalistic rigor because there is also a very big part of independent media. There is a lot of independent media, I think. And for example, one reason for me to get into YouTube is also the other side. And that is like, oh my God, the stories on YouTube are wild. It's absolutely crazy. I mean, you mentioned you shouldn't be branded a conspiracy theorist too easily. And I totally agree. But then again, there is a sea of conspiracy theories out there. And so maybe what you can bring, or what I'm hoping to get from the blind spot is like, the controversial stories, but with the journalistic rigor.
100%. I totally agree. And that's why I'm very keen to stress that my vision for the blind spot is also about credit and value-centered journalism. And it's about
what is value-centered journalism?
Sorry. Yes, it's just a concept I've created. But the idea is that in independent journalism, you have to be value-led, and you have to live transparently by those values. I think there are two parts of value-driven journalism. The legacy is obviously the different newspapers and media offerings, which are value-centered as far as the customers are concerned. But the reality is that the masthead values are often not shared by the employees, because the nature of journalism is so competitive that the recruitment side of it, you're not necessarily hiring individuals who are aligned with the values of the paper. You're hiring people who want to get a job in journalism, and they might mask their true political values, or they might mask their, they won't necessarily be adherents of the masthead. So you will get, a lot of people getting jobs at the Wall Street Journal who maybe don't really want to be capitalists or whatever. I don't know, or at the Guardian, who was, different way inclined. So there's a mismatch between the writers and the masthead values. And that never used to be a problem in the old days, because there was a very strong hierarchy, and I think there was a norm that ensured that the values of the paper had to be fundamentally aligned with no matter what. But I think in recent years, that has changed due to the power of networks and the power of community organization within journalistic and other corporate structures, where people are aligning according to their real values and trying to kind of change the values of the paper from the inside. And that is one of the phenomena that I think is bad for readers, because readers are still buying the FT or the Wall Street Journal for what they perceive the open, transparent values to be. Mm-hmm. They're not necessarily buying it to be campaigned, in a different way, or for a different agenda to be thrown at them, right?
Do you mean then that the political narratives or political camps are sort of taking over these media outlets? Like how, I don't know, perhaps a left-wing group might take over The Guardian, and a right-wing group, might take over, I don't know, like Fox News or so. Well, even if I don't know if they had to take it over, but is that what you mean?
Yeah. So basically, I think there is the new generation of younger reporters, I don't think are happy to settle for the values of the organization they join. They want to change them. They're like women who want to change men when they marry them. And that's what I say. They marry them for X, and they're like, no, well, don't worry, I'll work on him. And by the time I'm finished with him, he'll be exactly how I intend him to be. So I feel that's kind of what's going on. And to that degree, I don't think that's very transparent with readers. And I think you have to be honest with who you are and what you are. Now, so, within a liberal newspaper, that's fine. Yeah. If I think the FT, historically is a pro-business, pro-finance paper that is going to entertain all sorts of different perspectives, because markets don't discriminate, and you need to see the big picture. You need to understand all perspectives to get the clearing price of any product, right? Or any share price or any asset. So that's why when people kind of freeze out different opinions, I don't think that's good for markets. So in the blind spot, I want to be very transparent about my own biases, so people know. I don't think bias is a problem. I think actually it's impossible in the modern media system to not have a bias. You just have to be transparent about your bias, and also transparent about how you want to correct for your bias, maybe.
So what are your biases then, Izabella?
My biases are that, the obvious one is that who I am, which is that I'm a West London, Polish heritage, English woman who is in her 40s. That's obviously going to give me one perspective. But politically, I see myself as like the archetypal flip-flopper who is the sort of person who's always going to be waiting to be convinced by a narrative. So I try to not make assumptions, and I tend to counterbalance things. So in my broad political history, I've dabbled with all sorts of perspectives. So I find myself quite hard to pigeonhole in some ways. But I can tell you that right now, I feel, I'm not. I tend to go through phases in my writing. So I had a tech utopian phase, then I had a very cynical phase. Now I'm in a sort of trying to push back against some of the consensus that is out there. And I think it's very important to push forward with free speech. I'm not a free speech maximalist because I do actually believe there are important constraints on speech, but I think it's gone too far in one way. And so, but at the same time, as you were saying, value-centered journalism is also about rigor and making sure that it's not just about, you mustn't ignore things and then therefore you consume all this crap that's on the internet. It's about being able to differentiate, but it's also about not being scared to look at certain things from that sort of banned area and think, well, actually, this thing that's there, that's actually truthful. Like, we can pluck that because they've got a point on that. You can't. So it's about being able to differentiate and to not, a lot of the disinfo that's out there, and my view generally on disinfo is that it's everywhere. I don't think it's of the left or of the right only. I think the entire system has become consumed by disinfo, not just because of the political disinfo and the state-sponsored disinfo, but because of the corporate practices out there to bury bad news, to talk just the corporate and PR spin alone has polluted the information space as well. So as a journalist on the front line, you are continuously, you have to be on guard because you are continuously being bombarded with spin one way or the other. So yeah, that's my general perspective about value-centered journalism, is that you have to do your homework and you have to be transparent when you don't know something, and you have to be transparent about when you speculate about things, amongst other things. And as long as you're transparent about it, I think that's okay.
Yeah, I think that I broadly agree with a lot of that. Like, for example, being on YouTube and publishing my own stories, I do take sides sometimes, or I do put my own spin on a story. But one of my core values is to always publish all the sources in link, in text, so that people really can make up their mind about my biases, for example. And what I also try to do in the more controversial videos is feature the best counterpoints to my points, because I think that's just really important, and it's lacking a little bit. But I think what we should do actually is answer a couple of audience questions. But before doing that, I had this very burning question that I wanted to ask you, because you are a bit of an insider in the journalism industry, and mainly, I guess, the economic outlets. But because you were basically implying that sort of certain political camps or certain agendas are taking over certain media or corporate media outlets. So I was wondering, who's taking over then the Financial Times, and who has taken over sort of the other media outlets like Wall Street Journal, Economist? How would you describe that landscape?
I mean, it's not I wouldn't describe it as some sort of political group or party. I think it's more of a movement, or a youth movement, really, that is focused on forwarding. So back in the day, obviously journalists were always part of unions. We had the National Union, of Journalists is a thing. But those unions were usually focused on forwarding the interests of journalists from a commercial, from a simple kind of let's make sure they're paid properly, unionized to get a better deal and treatment and blah, blah, blah. But mostly it was to do with how you were treated as a journalist. Whereas I think now, a lot more, there are organizations focused not just on the treatment of journalists, they're focused on the content within the journalistic houses. So if there is a story that upsets any particular internal group, they will lobby for that story to be deprioritized, or they will lobby to have some input on that particular subject area, right? Because they feel that, we shouldn't be platforming X, Y, or Z, or, so I think there is a bit of a schism inside, many journalistic outfits regarding these platforming issues, and the old school mentality really is that platforming doesn't mean endorsement. It means challenging someone. It means understanding who they are. It's about telling the story and often pushing back against what they're saying if they're saying nonsense, right? It's about entering into the spirit of debate and being aware of these pockets of, even when it comes to extremist situations, like you want to be able to interview, Lionel Barber interviewed Vladimir Putin, right? That is, we platformed Vladimir
of the
Putin,
FT, right? Is Lionel Barber.
Yeah, that was the former editor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is not seen as a bad thing in journalism, never used to be. Mm-hmm. But these days, I think there is this like strange, I find it quite absurd that we can't platform certain like rogue operators, but we can others. And the FT hasn't been as bad as, I don't want to talk too much about the FT because obviously I still think it's one of the best papers in the world. Mm-hmm. And I still think it has incredibly sound practices. And I don't think what is happening to the FT is unique to the FT. I think it's a broader thing. And perhaps the FT is a bit more resistant to it actually than other areas. But
that's the
it
impression
is still happening.
Yeah. So, but who is? I'm still looking a little bit for the juicy details, though, Izabella. Like, who is not giving a platform, for example, and who is perhaps being giving too much of a platform, or is that the wrong way to say?
Well, I think there are some well-known stories that were recently, criticized. I think if anyone writes about anything controversial, they will get internal kind of pushback, whether it's about renewables or whether it's stories about nuclear, or whether it's stories about trans, or whether it's stories about Muslims in France. I mean, these are just a number of stories that have had internal pushback, right? So
you mean then, just to give a little bit of perspective for everybody watching, so you mean like, for example, nuclear may be good, or we can ask questions about the trans movement. Is that sort of the angles that are being pushed back against?
I mean, that issue isn't like a dominant one at the FT for obvious reasons, because it's not something that is paramount to markets and finance. But I do think there is a general, the lab leak story is one story that got, I think, unfairly sidelined. But that wasn't because of internal pushback. That was, I think, more because of stigma and fear. But yeah, I think if there is a sort of, I mean, I am pro-market, I'm pro-capitalism in the old school sense of not crony capitalism. I'm
pro-competition,
liberal democracy and all that, right? That's my position. Mm-hmm. But I do think that some of that is being challenged internally, and there is a growing kind of inclination to lean on the more, I don't know if it's leftist, but like I don't actually think left and right really is a fair descriptor these days of the big, like the big split in society. I think it's more about pro-state, pro-government, pro-centralization versus more decentralization, more kind of self-autonomous, libertarian. That's, I think, the split these days. And one tribe really resents and looks down on the other tribe. And they're both, I sit somewhere in the middle and I see the virtues and the downsides of both.
And
and I think that's why for me...
tribe is strong. The decentralization tribe is pretty strong at the FT these days then, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I would think that it's very hard to operate nimbly.
Mm-hmm. But basically at most media, big media outlets, right? Are there any media outlets?
I can only speak for the ones that I've experienced myself, but yeah.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I think I would love to dive a little bit more into the specifics. But would you have a look with me at what people are saying?
I don't want to. You've got to be open to. You've got to appreciate that I don't want to. Because I don't blame any particular person for what's going on. I think it's a broader trend, right? And I think a lot of this stuff is unwitting and. If you were to speak to another journalist at the FT, they would probably completely agree. Izzy's mad, it's all in her head. So I think there is no consensus on this. This is just my reading of the situation, and I have to stress that it made me feel uncomfortable. But I come from a very unique background. I'm Polish. My parents were, they experienced communism. They experienced like an oppressed environment. They experienced mass centralization and the inability to kind of, operate independently. That was my upbringing. So maybe I'm more tuned into these things than other people. I never used to be that tuned into that part of my history. But I think in recent years, I've come to really appreciate it. Because I think there is a sort of tendency to shut down challenging stories. And then there are other issues, which are just like legal liability issues. And that's, one of the, you're asking me very specific questions, but, as a journalist, I'm very aware of like libel, and I'm very aware of, what you can and cannot say without, a load of evidence to back up what you're saying. So, to make an off the cuff remark is in public, we were talking about journalism that is done with rigor, and you can't just make accusations without, you need a right of reply. It wouldn't be fair for me to make, that's why I don't want to. You're asking very pointed questions, but I don't think it's fair for me to comment outside the other perspective being in the room as well. So that's why I'm shying away from those questions.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that's perhaps a little bit because I am on YouTube. I don't have that many people checking my work, like in the similar spirit that you mentioned earlier. That might be helpful from time to time.
What I will say is that what I've personally noticed, and I think this is public domain, so it's not an issue, is that when you read the comments in the FT, I think there's a definite divide between those who sort of see it's still doing its job and they're very happy that it's become more of a campaigning newspaper and it's focused on, the new agenda is its motto, and, moral money and compassionate capitalism and all this other stuff, right? So I'd say like half of that community really goes for it. But there's another half that I can see is, just from feedback, incredibly cynical about what's going on. And and laments for the days when Alphaville was a little bit more risque. And I think I want to service those readers because I can see that they are being left out. And I think there's also this is my impression and I could be wrong, but I feel that they feel like they're being patronized a little bit by their newspaper. Yeah. And I don't think that is a good sort of relationship to have with your readers. And, whether there is a perspective or not that like a lot of the readers are old dinosaurs that are outdated and should be, city people, the old city stereotype. And, but at the end of the day, that they're the people that pay your salary. So it's like telling them they're awful, horrible people all the time is not constructive, I don't think.
Yeah. No, well, to maybe I can give a small example myself as well, and then I will definitely move to the comments. I know I promised it multiple times already, but I see it with the inflation story as well, where I am actually going in a little bit sort of on the they would say, I think, dovish side, because I am in a different world. I'm in YouTube space where the sort of hyperinflation is coming narrative is extremely strong. But what I also see is that at the more established outlets, they don't want to address serious concerns about inflation, for example, right? Like that, for example, house prices are not in the inflation index. People comment that quite often, that is ridiculous. Well, I do push back then often in the sense that I say, well, but a house is a consumption asset and it's an investment asset. So there are reasons for this. and it's not necessarily a big conspiracy, but I do try to at least shed light on the subject and to take it seriously, because for many people, it doesn't matter because their house prices are going up. They can no longer live in the city. So who cares? It's an investment asset. And so I do see that many of the more sort of established corporate outlets, then just totally go the other way. So I think there's then often the middle ground is lacking a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know if this fits in.
I would agree.
Excellent.
Well, and I think that's what I always aspired to do on Alphaville, is just to be able. So I think people kind of confuse that sometimes I kind of try on a different hat to see things from a different perspective, because I think that teaches you valuable insights about what's going on. And unless you have the capacity to see things from a different point of view, you do. I mean, the cliche, you have a blind spot. And that doesn't necessarily mean that when I'm trying on this other hat, I necessarily agree with everything on that position, right? It's more like when you focus a camera, you just want to see the different perspectives to get the optimal view. But there is a lot of resistance, I think, these days to trust just looking at things from a different perspective. I think that one of the good examples of this is the BBC, which everybody seems to hate. Like whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right, everybody seems to hate the BBC. And I too am critical of one thing about the BBC. I do think over COVID they really leaned into the kind of terror side of things, but so did all the other media, and it was a very packed journalism thing. But that said, my general take on the BBC is the fact that everyone hates them probably means they're doing the right thing, because obviously that means they are looking at things from different perspectives. And if everyone thinks that they're being discriminated against in favor of the other side, probably that's just them being very sensitive. So I tend to defend the BBC on that front.
All right. Hey, shall we have a look at the chat and see what people are asking, or if they haven't done so, maybe you want to ask some questions to Izabella. Can you see the chat?
Yeah, someone's asked if someone would give me a bag of money and I didn't need to worry about income for the years to come, what topic would you spend your time on? Well, I think it's hard to predict, obviously, what topic. I'm always fascinated in the financial plumbing and in payments and central banking, but also the big sweeping kind of market mechanism developments in the world. One of my hunches is that the corporation construct itself is going to be, not because of Web3 or anything like that. I just think that we're going to really rethink how a lot of the corporate value, is generated, and this might deconstruct some elements of the corporation. So those are areas I'm interested in, but also I personally don't think that this skirmish in Ukraine is just a fleeting thing. I think there's a bigger geopolitical pivot point happening. I think that we are on the verge of it's the Thucydides trap coming to life, and I suspect there's going to be a period of probably at least 3 to 4 years of quite radical readjustment in global economics, supply chains, and power relationships. It's going to make for an incredibly rich source of news and analysis. I think it's going to be an absolutely insane thing to cover, and it's going to be as broad as covering commodities to becoming an expert in certain sort of military tactics. I think that there will be, I want to focus on the sort of very niche blind spots that the market in general hasn't necessarily picked up on. I think so much information out there, no one can really process it all. And the job that I want to do on the blind spot is basically zoom in on those areas of expertise, really unpack those little specialist areas as they come into the fore when they become relevant, whether that's learning about, ballistic missiles, or whether it's about learning about epidemiology or chemicals, warfare, or something more vanilla infrastructure and commodities, some sort of weird commodity markets. I think that's what the blind spot wants to do. Like we want to navigate through this chaos and present spotlights for when things become relevant, and they're not in the mainstream press. They're being overlooked because the mainstream press is being incredibly shouty about whatever the top line narrative is. Whereas I want to kind of focus on what's being buried in the other, what's being buried in the news whilst everyone's looking here. This is what's going on here. That's what I wanted.
There's also this question that caught my eye, which is about how do you balance between contrarianism and conspiracy, by Noah Gores, and he's mentioning the example of Richard Werner, who's a professor. I think you might know, but I'm not sure. Tell me if that's the case.
Somebody keeps telling me about him, but I've not actually looked at his stuff. So
he's written this book,
want
Princes of the Yen. Have you heard of that one? It's about
what's his theory? I'm actually not familiar with his theory. Someone does keep telling me I should look at it, and I haven't yet.
So it's very much about like banks create money and debt, and then he's written extensively about Japan. It has actually influenced my thinking quite a bit, but about the bust of Japan at the end of the 80s. But he is then taking it very much into the sort of, in my opinion, conspiracy side. Where he's like saying this was sort of a mastermind plan by the Japanese central bankers to push neoliberalism on the country by force. But also, like as Noah in the chat is mentioning, he now apparently has a rather extreme take on vaccines. And I remember as well, like checking out his Twitter feed, a lot of chemtrail related messages. But okay, I guess the point of the question is more like, do you see that sort of conflict between contrarianism and conspiracy, and how do you deal with it?
Well, I'm really like, so I'm really cynical about. Look, first of all, I just think these days it's impossible to do good investigative journalism because everything is a conspiracy theory. Like Wirecard is the best example of that. Like, frankly. That was a criminal conspiracy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it wasn't a theory, it was just a conspiracy. Now, Dan McCrum and Paul Murphy, who covered that story, they were accused of the most preposterous things. They were all making it up and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So I find this like entire attitude of like, well, no, this is a conspiracy theory. It obstructs real journalism. And the real journalism takes something like chemtrails, right? And like, okay, so somebody tells you this chemtrail. Okay, right. I don't know anything about this topic, right? But the journalistic process is, okay, someone tells you a tip. If it's interesting, if there's anything that suggests there's any supporting evidence, well, then you look into it. And then you, like Erin Brockovich, you build a case, right? If there's some sort of pollution or whatever, blah, 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 you build a case, right? And yes, you do tend to have a selective bias when you start doing that process. And that's why in good journalistic practice, you go down the rabbit hole a little bit and then you pull back and then you go and speak to some people who might give you a different perspective and you try to balance things out. But when the evidence starts to demonstrate that actually there is something to this, you don't constrain it because of fear that you might unfold a conspiracy. Conspiracies are real. Like there are conspiracies out there. Like this idea that there are no conspiracies is silly, right? So what I think has happened maybe is that conspiracy theory itself, in the case of Wirecard, was used as a way. I mean, it became a weapon in discrediting the journalist, right? So when a journalist is like pursuing a story and they're increasingly getting somewhere with it, so often you're then like pushed back, well, this is a conspiracy theory. You don't know what you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes that is true. And sometimes you are, taking, 2 and 2 and making 17, right? But other times, and no, oh my God, just in case 17 just came into my head. It's nothing to do with any. Just realized.
17. I don't get the reference, to be honest.
2 and 2 and because we're talking about conspiracy theories, and 17 is the Q. So that was accident.
Okay.
I didn't do it on purpose.
Oh man, I didn't know about that. Okay.
In case anyone but because I did a film about QAnon, and so I know that, but that was an accident.
But does 17 then mean that you're part of the Q side or the other side, or is it not like that at all?
It's just a reference. It's just Q is the 17th letter in the alphabet, so it's just a way of recognizing.
Okay.
It's like this is the bad side of conspiracy theory. So the problem with the QAnon is that they're not trained journalists, so they go out and they start looking. Like they look at the internet and they scour everything and they go, well, this happened at this time, and because that person was in the same room as XYZ, that means they must be connected, and therefore we've got a link, and they are definitely in cahoots, right? That's how QAnon thinks, right? And the reality is that sometimes people will be in the same room and blah blah blah, and there's a picture of X with X, and that means blah blah blah, and you can investigate it, and then but then you use your judgment and you go, well, there are lots of circumstances where someone might be in the same room, but they have absolutely nothing to do with that person, right? And you can't just draw a conclusion because two people are in the same picture, right? So a journalist will, I would say, someone with good, who follows best practice wouldn't jump to the conclusion that is definitely, you have to maintain the idea that innocent until proven guilty. Like you've got to make your case. You've got to get more than circumstantial evidence. You've got to treat it like a court case, right? Whereas the QAnons don't do that. They just take X and Y and they just presume, that means cabal, whatever. And that, I think, is the difference. And they also don't have access. So they don't have the journalists take information, but they also then make calls and they speak to the people and they give, if someone's been accused of X or Y, we call them up and we hear their side of the story before we start spreading malicious gossip about them. That's how it's supposed to act. That's how it's supposed to operate, right? And I think that's the difference between conspiracy theory and journalism, is that journalism is verified. It's, it can be speculative and you will have narratives and angles and biases, but by and large, you can't make a ridiculous accusation without a hell of a lot of evidence behind what you're suggesting.
Yeah, but now,
so I don't know this Werner guy, but if there is evidence if there is enough evidence, there's that no smoke without fire, then at a minimum, this was my point with lab leaks. I felt there was enough evidence to merit an investigation, right?
Yeah, I looked into this as well. They definitely had a good case. You don't
and
know.
That's what, and I felt that in that case, conspiracy theory had been weaponized to suppress the investigation. And I think we have to be conscious of the fact that we shouldn't just knee-jerk X says this, so therefore it's a conspiracy theory. Because conspiracy theory then becomes an obstacle to good journalism. Yeah. And it becomes stigmatized to do any proper inquiries.
One thing I do wonder.
And often, it's the whole, sometimes people, they say a little knowledge is dangerous. And I've seen that happen so many times with central banking and Bitcoin and crypto. And these people jump to wild conclusions, and it's because they don't know the mechanics. And so they make assumptions that, look, a classic one is QE is money printing.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, no, it's an asset size sterilized. It's not the same thing. And it's because of the economy. And then now, so many years later, I look at that and I go, well, I used to be really annoyed with them saying it's money printing, because I'd be like, no, mechanically, it's blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But they kind of had a point. And maybe it's a bit basic, and maybe they don't know why they've arrived at the right answer. But we were a bit snobbish in terms of just, sometimes the basic intuitive gut feeling should also not be dismissed. So I've become a little bit more open-minded and pragmatic. And I think sometimes there are so many bad incentives out there for people to push bullshit at you that, frankly, being a bit inclined to think that people are using X or Y as a cover, it doesn't strike me. I mean, there's enough historical record of crazy cover-ups and corporate malpractice to resonate. I don't see what's wrong with doing the investigation, and we don't even get to the investigation point in this day and age. That's my point. If you do the investigation and then you conclude, well, there's nothing here, that's fine.
So one thing that I will say on this, because Yeah, sadly, you have another appointment, I think, in like 2 minutes. So I feel obliged.
Sorry.
I feel sad to point it out, but I also feel obliged to do this for you. One thing that I do want to say on it is that I wonder how your perspective will change on this, and maybe we can talk about it later at some point in half a year or something, because it does come across a little bit as though, I mean, you have been in an environment for so long where they've been pushing you hard back against this, using this, weaponizing conspiracies, right? But now you're, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're entering an arena of the independent journalists where you're going to compete with all the conspiracy people. Basically, maybe I shouldn't say it like that, but what I find difficult, at least when trying to at least do more background research, is that sort of when I do one properly researched story, the conspiracy channels have 10 stories out. Do you see what I mean? So I wonder.
Oh yeah, because doing all that stuff that I was talking about, all the verification and actually reporting things out, takes time and energy, and that's what the money. That's why journalism needs subscribers. That's why if it's free, you're the product. If it's free, like I'd be suspicious of all the stuff on the internet that's free, because I mean, obviously advertising, but like there's an agenda behind it, and the fact that they can pump out X, Y, Z, it shows, with limited resources, is very suspicious, I think, because there's only so much bandwidth. So yes, I think to differentiate yourself as an independent journalist, that's why I am very keen to focus on a feedback mechanism that can hold you to account to your own values. So if you're there saying, I don't do access journalism and I don't do this and I always verify and I always get right a reply and I always, blah, blah, blah. If there's evidence that you don't do that, there should be some sort of feedback or kind of like a bounty for people to help you keep your standards to the right level, basically.
Yeah.
And that's what I hope to create with the blind spot. Is I want to create a very clear and transparent value and code of practice, and then sort of, essentially give readers an incentive to if they can point out where I'm failing my own code of conduct, I'd like to flag it and to make sure that there is a sort of mechanism that can keep me in check, because I think that is really important.
So I'm very much looking forward to this, and definitely just want to say again that people should hopefully subscribe to your YouTube channel, get you to the 1,000 followers, because then you told me that you wanted to do quite a few live activities there as well, which are only possible after 1,000 subscribers. So please, I'll post the link again in the chat later on, and I will definitely stick around to answer some of the many more questions, because I think maybe in hindsight this stream was too short, because I feel we haven't done talking yet. There's so much more I want to ask you, but we might still have an opportunity to do that at some point. Or if you do want to stick around, you're more than welcome.
I've got another 10 minutes if you want, and then I have to make a phone call. But.
Okay, excellent. Well, can I then just ask, because I think we haven't really talked about it yet. I just want to clarify, because I saw some people in the chat, you were referring to the theory of some very difficult Greek name that I now forgot, about the demise of Athens. The demise of Sparta versus the rise of Athens, I think, and the war that then broke out. And I think you were referring to it at the time we live in now, that we have this rise of some superpowers, like, for example, China, and definitely you have the relative decline, I would say, of the West and also the United States. So I was wondering, are we heading for World War III, or are we actually heading for Cold War II?
So I think it's a mistake to think that any new war is going to look like the last war.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're coming into a new war, but there are new technologies, there are new ways of living. And so to suggest it's going to be like the Cold War or the Second World War or the First World War or the Battle of Marathon or whatever is the wrong way to look at it. I think World War III, whatever it is, will be its own thing. And it's going to be increasingly focused on hybrid warfare. And I think it's going to have flashpoints every now and then. But I think really it's going to, my concern is that it ends up being like a perpetual war type situation, because the real the real elephant in the room is the financial underlying fragility of the system that we've created and our exposure to the climate costs and the energy crisis, right? So this is like a civilization pivot point. And to make it through, we either do that with like some new technological advance that hasn't arrived yet, or we have to restrict and really control the population in ways that we haven't had to do for a very long time. And as we try to, create collective solutions for things like climate change, that is going to lead to power struggles between those countries that still want to develop and aren't happy to constrain their consumption at this point, right? So whatever way we're looking at it, there is definitely a transition of power going on, I think. Whether it's clear cut, I don't think it's going to necessarily be the same thing where, we move from the British Empire to the American Empire to the Chinese Empire. I suspect it's going to be more multipolar because all the empires have the same problem this time round. There is no new growth without some sort of massive innovation somewhere.
Yeah.
And in that context,
and there's massive debt everywhere.
Massive debt everywhere. And I think in that context, all these different powers, they benefit from creating a foreign enemy perspective, right? So they can rally their own people by, it's cliche, but it's the Orwellian perpetual war where, Oceania is perpetually, fearful of Eurasia and etc. And then, so you can see like China will use the West as the bogeyman, and then Russia will use the West as the bogeyman, and we will use maybe both Russia and China. I don't know. I mean, I'm not making any assumptions, and this is just my inkling is that there will be this multipolar world, and I've forgotten the question now.
Oh, well,
Thucydides trap, but so it's more.
You've answered it.
It's not just a Thucydides trap. It's not just that China is emerging as the new power. It's emerging into a constrained power relationship because it can't. There is this natural limit, which is the carbon situation. So, I think it's going to be for finance and markets. Also, the challenge is how you transition to growth that is increasingly dematerialized, I think.
To be honest,
and digital.
I don't see this. How is carbon really the limit, I wonder? Because how I see it more is that especially private debt is the limit. And like, how is carbon the limit? Because can't economies just grow on? And then, sure, I know that, or likely global warming will kick in and do horrible things. But isn't that largely outside of the major powers that are creating the carbon output, if you catch my drift, all right? So Europe, US, China going to be fine.
Energy consumption I think energy consumption is intimately connected with growth. I think if you look at like energy consumption and growth, it tracks almost identically. And so if there's a constraint to cheap energy and lacking an innovation like fusion or something that can give us the next growth phase, then the Roman Empire collapsed because of, frankly, not enough. They never made the innovation leap to using fossil fuels, right? So their empire got too large. They couldn't manage it. The bureaucracy got out of order, too much control, and effectively it had to break off and fragment and become the makings of the Middle Ages, right? So that's the worst case scenario for us, is that everything fragments out and we have this collapse of civilization where our energy footprint comes down, but not because we are improving our lifestyle. To the contrary, it's because everyone has to go back to the medieval times, basically. And that's the worst case scenario, right? The best case scenario is that we find a new tech and we are able to innovate our way out of it. And we should be doing everything, in my opinion, to encourage innovation so that we can make that leap. But as it stands, where we are now is in this weird middle ground where there is in my opinion, and I know people will challenge me on this, but there's a false narrative, I think, out there that the technology is here to take us into net zero. I don't agree that the technology is here. I think it's not. And because the technology is here, if the alternative is that we can't continue to mine cheap fossil fuels, then that means the growth situation, the only way you can correct for it is with basically growth being suspended on a global level. That's my take.
That's interesting. So I have to say that I don't think about it like that, but I have to add to that energy is my blind spot still a little bit. So it's not my specialty. And I do think that my bias is to make everything about money and about monetary factors.
But money is energy. I mean, the two are intimately connected. Like everything is ultimately an input of energy. So everything, all economic activity ultimately derives from some sort of source point of energy, whether it's human energy, but human energy is powered by agriculture. Like in the Ukraine crisis right now, a much overlooked aspect of it is the nat gas situation, right?
And what's the nat gas situation?
Well, there's a shortage of nat gas, and that is entirely our own doing, which has empowered Putin.
Gas on the net, you mean?
Huh?
Like, what do you mean with net gas? Like, just gas, basically, for Europe, or?
Well, natural gas.
Oh, natural gas. Okay, sorry. I was looking for the grid or the net in that.
Natural gas. So basically, we've created a shortage through our net zero policy because my opinion, we've run before we can walk, and pushed ahead with policies that have constrained for years and years, the interim solution for this problem was that we would transition through nat gas. And nat gas was actually going to be, it's like an ironic behavioral thing where even though technically it's still a fossil fuel, because it's a much less intensive expenditure of carbon, it's still a net gain to basically transition from oil and coal to nat gas. And you're going to get greater savings from doing that than going like cold turkey to net zero, because when you go net zero, you have to spend a lot more fuel, actual carbon fuel, to create all those like renewable resources in the first place. And secondly, the people who can't afford those resources will end up using much dirtier and cheaper fuels like wood and coal. And that's exactly what's happened in Germany, which is that, the fact that Germany has now closed its nuclear production and has made itself entirely dependent on Russian gas, ironically, is incredibly, that was, and it wasn't even a blind spot. It was so well flagged. So that to me is like handing over control to Putin. I mean, it was
that emboldened Putin to invade Ukraine. If I can make it concretely, is that sort of what you're saying?
Well, yeah, because we're in a situation where he calls the shots because we can't sanction him properly because then we don't get any energy or food, and it translates into food because nat gas is a key component in the production of food and fertilizer. So without nat gas, we've already got, because of the cost of nat gas, this was very well flagged in November, which is why when I went on some news channel in November, I was saying that February would be the moment that everything would come to the fore, because it was clear that would be the time that our gas stocks would be entirely depleted. And at that point, that would be peak Putin power, because he has us over a barrel because he can dictate whatever he wants. But also in the interim, gas prices have been so high that farmers haven't bought the fertilizer they need because they were hoping prices would go down, but they haven't come down. So this now looks like that this will lead to like a 5 to 10% yield destruction in farming in Europe this year. They're planting late already and likely to plant even later because of the lack of fertilizer. That makes Ukraine a kingmaker asset because Ukraine is one of the biggest grain producers in the world. And if you think that, in terms of gas, the balance point is Qatar and the LNG producers who are now balancing the imbalances. Ukraine provides the balancing grain assets. So it's like having the SPR of grain if you control Ukraine. And, you dictate if Egypt gets food or not, because through the Black Sea, so much of the grain from Ukraine goes to the Middle East. So Putin knows this, and I don't think the implications on food have really been thought through properly. This isn't a conspiracy. This is just practical, pragmatic analysis.
Yeah, and this story is not in the news much, right? So this is why we need the blind spot.
Yeah. It's one of the stories that I think is like, that's the sort of bigger geopolitical, so easy to go knee jerk, like, oh, remember even the Gulf War, everyone's just, it's easy to like have a very simplistic take on this, but power, money, capital is ultimately I'm an ancient historian. That's what I studied at university. And those are the three things that determine all geopolitics ultimately. And I think it's very, very naive to think that there aren't massive sort of political level, plans being laid to try and like gain access and control over these things.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And you have, to a certain extent, opened my eyes a little bit about this energy issue, in the sense that, so the piece of the puzzle that I didn't see is that what you mentioned about fertilizers for farmers here in Europe. Because I did know that like both Russia and Ukraine are massive wheat producers. And what I found is that, okay, so Egypt, like you mentioned, but also I think Indonesia and Vietnam are massive importers of wheat from Russia and the Ukraine. But I didn't make the connection to Europe, because I'm from the Netherlands myself, which is also a massive agriculture producer. But basically, you are saying that our farmers, if I can say that, now have a fertilizer problem, because that was not on my radar. So okay, so that's super interesting. I will definitely look into that.
They have a fertilizer problem. They also have, just generally, they're going to have to compete increasingly with international markets for a lot of their input costs. So just general inputs, amongst which, and then there's other like commodity related things, like helium is also a controlling asset an asset that people want to control at the moment, because that's got shortage issues. And helium is a vital component in semiconductors.
And
there aren't that many helium.
Who has it?
So helium can be made. So the connection between helium and nat gas is that nat gas is used in the helium extraction process.
Okay.
So de facto, even if Ukraine doesn't like it, gas impacts the helium, because without it's like fertilizer you need the gas to get the fertilizer. So that's the connection of helium.
Damn. Yeah. You're making me worried.
Sorry.
But the one connection that I did think about that I think is interesting, like there's now, at least on YouTube, there's this massive sort of conspiracy gut feeling, if you will, about sort of the end of the world and sort of the crashing of most economies. And what I do think is interesting is that you mentioned specifically, like very often these gut feelings have a grain of truth to them, but it's just like the information that's actually relevant is not packed into these theories. But you are coming across as really strongly arguing or believing in a massive regime shift that's starting just now. And is that a correct summary?
Yeah, I think there is a sort of massive geopolitical change going on at the moment. I think there is the period of, I'm a historian ultimately, and I think we all get very complacent about this idea that the end of history, and that things history always progresses and it only goes up. I'm of the ancient history school of Polybius. I see things in cycles, and I don't think it's wise to, as soon as you think it's going to be one way, it's usually not. So that's how blind spots occur, when you get complacent and when the crowd becomes convinced that X is always going to be X, you can be damn sure there's going to be something that pops that bubble, and no one will have seen it coming.
Yeah. And who, by the way, this is some other related question now that I still have you here. Who should I talk about regarding this energy dimension? Because I really want to learn more about this. Do you have some recommendations? Or who should maybe the chat read about, or myself? Like, who are the...
I mean, it really depends. You see, this is, again, like the energy, like realistic voices on the energy issue are few and far between because of the pressure to conform to the consensus on energy. So, I mean, who's good on it. Like any practitioner, anyone actually physically trading or dealing in energy. The sad thing is that the big sort of commodity traders are so conscious of their PR that that they also have like we were talking about journalism. There's a disconnect between what they do and what their philosophy is, and this is this kind of corporate virtue signaling is incredibly damaging for the economy, because corporations that are supposedly profit, they're supposed to be profit maximizing in their fields, but they're not profit maximizing because they're doing things for virtuous reasons. But as a result, that creates a gap in the economy, right? So, or it creates a sort of wishful thinking effect where they think, oh, well, as long as we're virtuous enough, then we can manifest, the outcomes that we desire, irrespective of what the reality is. And reality is really quite, you can't, it knocks on the door and goes, hello, I'm here, I'm a gas, you said you'd have like net zero, it'd be lovely, and we'd have wind farms, but actually, look, I'm the gas deficit and I'm knocking on your door. People who are upfront about that are few and far between. I've spoken to quite a lot of consultants on it, and some of them are very high level, very well regarded in the industry. And they're scared to talk because they will be disparaged because it's such an unpopular perspective. I mean, now, thanks to the Russia situation, in some ways, there is a bit more realism coming into play. And I've heard suddenly a lot of kind of revisionism from a few people in terms of how they feel about the gas and net zero situation. I do see that happening now, but it's few and far between. I think you've got voices like Michael Schellenberger, who has been saying this for years, but he was dismissed as a weirdo and a conspiracy theorist. Again, not a conspiracy, but I mean, he came from the Green movement, and his basic spiel, I thought he was very convincing, frankly. But he was one of the voices that it was challenging to platform on any kind of like serious publication, because he was saying what people didn't want to hear, which is that renewables are not there yet. We can't do the transition because the technology hasn't arrived yet. And people don't want to hear that, so they shut him down. And it's very it's very weird. Whereas I want to hear those voices and I want to platform them up so that we can find the solutions to the problems, not just ignore them.
Yeah, you're really making me want to platform this person on the Money and Macro channel, Izabella.
Well, Michael Schellenberger is great. I did interview him, but like in the end, we didn't run the podcast, so I ended up doing it somewhere else. But he was great. He's got I think he's got a column in, I think maybe it's Forbes or Fortune, I can't remember. But he's also independent, and he did the Joe Rogan interview not long ago. So
okay, yeah. Oh, that's a big platform. I'll definitely look up that podcast then. So I also see a lot of people in the chat sort of going on about nuclear, and that also ties into something that I was myself thinking, like, can't we just build a ton of power plants? Like, I know the political will isn't there, but can't we just do that? Like build a massive amount of nuclear power plants? And I know it takes a while, but like theoretically.
Yeah, we can and we should. And that's basically what Michael Schellenberger is saying.
Okay.
But there is no political will. To the contrary, there is this weird stigma with nuclear, which is that it's incredibly dangerous and it's not green and therefore we can't do it. When actually, but there is so much more evolution in the technology of nuclear, and there are micro nuclear plants and really interesting innovations, and yet there is this kind of blanket perspective. Michael Schellenberger says it's because it arises from the kind of green lobby being quite anti-nuke and lefty, and so they see nukes as sort of like war, war hawky and very neocon, and therefore they don't want to be seen recommending nukes in any capacity, even in a power generating sense. But like again, nuclear is at the heart of the Ukraine story. Like if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, the Ukrainian nationalists they want to get their autonomy back by basically redeveloping all their nuclear facilities, and they do have active nuclear facilities in Ukraine already. They want to really invest in more of them. And obviously Chernobyl is also in Ukraine.
Which was just under siege or captured or something, I read.
Yes, exactly. So, but Chernobyl in a weird way is also the thing that like made nuclear completely not palatable. But if you look at the grand scheme of things, Chernobyl didn't kill that many people. I'm not saying every life lost is awful, don't get me wrong.
No.
And there were terrible repercussions for the environment, but in some ways, in terms of global tragedies, it wasn't the biggest in the world, but it's become the poster child of why you can't do nuclear.
Yeah.
And the Netflix documentary, when I talked to some of the nuclear specialists, they were very upset with that Netflix thing because they thought it really kind of mischaracterized the threats from nuclear.
Was that was it a proper documentary or was it like the drama series?
It was a drama series.
Oh, yeah,
it was really good.
I watched
but
it. It made me physically sick, so I can totally understand how people then, get antagonized against nuclear.
Yeah, and I think it was, according to nuclear experts I talked to, mischaracterizing a lot of the issues.
Yeah, but and then weirdly enough, like in the same spirit, Fukushima is even weirder, right? Like that was a super limited disaster, and it made Germany just switch off all of its power plants.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Fukushima. I mean, Fukushima was a tragedy, but I think it weirdly ended up being quite stimulative for the Japanese economy, if I recall, as well. So in terms of growth, after the tragedy, it helped to. I think there was a bit of obviously Japan's had a massive long-term issue with growth, but there was a sort of post-Fukushima boost
that had to do with the rebuilding because of the tsunami damage more than the power plant.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but it's all kind of connected in the sense of the tsunami and the Fukushima, that era anyway. But yeah, I think you're right. I think Fukushima was. I remember when it happened, everyone was so fearful that it would travel, and I'm not trying to downplay nuclear risks. They're obviously there, but I think most of the power plants we have are so old nowadays that Jonathan Ford did an excellent piece in the FT about the challenges of building a nuclear plant and how it takes 10 to 15 years to build a proper one. And to decommission them as well takes even longer sometimes. So do they ever really get decommissioned? Obviously the nuclear waste issue is a big problem. But yeah, that's I'm wittering, so I'm going to shut up.
Yeah, and this maybe I could just round it off by just saying that this brings me to the only problem that I do have with it. So I just recently moved to Belgium, and here we have, I think, 3 major nuclear power plants, but they're not properly maintaining them. They keep shutting off, and they're not building new ones, but they're also keeping these open. And this is the only thing that I do find difficult about this debate, because then, I sort of side with the Greens on this issue sometimes, because not maintaining one and keeping it open is also not good. Right? Just build new ones.
Yeah, but I think you've obviously got to maintain them. I don't know enough about it. I can't really comment because I don't know about it, but it strikes me as part of the kind of greater move away from nukes and coal, and a lot of these assets have become unloved because of this false narrative, in my opinion, that the new renewable technology is now capable of taking over, and I'm just not convinced it is. But based on the statistics, based on the costs, based on the actual recycling of the renewables themselves, just in terms of the economics, in terms of the land use, the battery power, the intermittency issue, these are all massive constraints. They work. Renewables work really well in an isolated capacity. If you're a little village in the middle of Africa and you get a nice solar panel, it's great. It works. It's brilliant. But that is completely different to powering a massive urban, environment where you need constant, reliable and accessible energy. And you don't have the space necessarily for the solar panels, so you need to the other issue with renewables is also the cost of transmission, which hasn't been thought through properly either. So, but I'm generalizing massively, and I shouldn't talk about things without researching them. I mean, I have researched it, but I haven't recently looked at it, so I don't want to.
Yeah, no, but I think
any disinfo.
The people who watch this stream are rather intelligent. After all, they subscribe to the Money Macro channel, but so I think they can see through that. I wouldn't worry about that. Thank you so much, Izabella.
No problem.
You know, you missed your call, right?
No, I'm gonna go. I've delayed it, but I have to do it now. So
okay, yeah.
All right.
Thanks so much for joining me, and please, people, follow Izabella on Twitter and also the Blind Spot, and have a look at our YouTube channel and help her reach 1,000 subscribers. Because I really think that in independent media we need more critical voices, but not necessarily only conspiracy voices.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. All right. Take
care.
care.
Bye.
Cheers. What have I missed? Did you enjoy this conversation? No, not physically. That was the the theory about Athens and Sparta. But Izabella also mentioned an expert on the energy field that wasn't necessarily taken seriously. Oh, Noah, do I still send by the video on sanctions? Yeah. So the sanctions, the more I read about it, the more they confirmed that they were rather weak in the sense that they just completely exempted the agricultural and energy sectors, which is very non-surprising in light of this conversation that I just had with Izabella. But the market reaction was stronger than I maybe would have expected. But, there could also be an overcorrection. Also, just always keep in mind that if you move into prediction of the future in any way, you might get it right, but you still get it wrong, if you know what I mean. Like you might say, okay, this is the most likely event, but like you might say, okay, the coin flip will land head because it's rigged to land on head 80% of the time, and it might still just land on tail, right? Okay, did I miss some other questions? So Antoine, I saw you mentioned that question from Patreon. I didn't ask her about how to get into journalism. I'm sorry, I didn't see the opening for it in the conversation we had. I did ask her. That was another question somebody mentioned on Patreon about the media landscape and how she sees that. I found it especially interesting. That I just wanted to tease out a little bit more, sort of like which people are with which ideology are in which newspaper. But I do understand that she was hesitant to talk about that a little bit, given that it's like your previous employer, right? But I do think there's just always so much there to talk to someone who's actually in that specific field, right? So, are there any other questions? Because otherwise I will head to dinner. So reading back, most of it is you all discussing among each other, right? The almost instinctively journalistic cautiousness is very yeah, that's true. So you definitely notice that I have less of that, right? I'm not a trained journalist, so maybe I will get in trouble with that at some point. But let's see. Michael Michael Schellenberger. Yeah, this is the name I will look up. I will look up that podcast. Energy is my blind spot. Maybe I should look more into it. Okay. Thank you all so much for attending this stream. I really enjoyed it. And if there are no further questions, I will head to dinner. I'm working on another Russia economy video, but it's a very difficult story. My lighting was better when there was two of me on screen. That's interesting. I'm actually looking at building a studio. So I might have a little bit of a change of scenery rather soon. So on Monday, someone's coming to help me out with that. Yeah, just to get a little bit more professional lighting and all of that, because here I'm just in my living room. And then you have the problem with light during the day. I think that's why it is. So we started when it was light, and now it's dark outside. And that made my lighting a little bit worse, I think. Anyhow, thank you all for joining. Take care. More videos will come, more live streams. I need to interview some more people about the massive change we might see in the global economy.